Dating back to the year 135 AD, not much is known about Saint Zoe. She was the wife of Hesperus. They were both slaves to a man named Catulus. They lived during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian. They were both brought up Christian, but had become lax in their faith. However, their children inspired to embrace their faith when they saw that they were willing to die when Christians were under persecution. When their master's first child was born, he wanted to offer meat to his gods in thanksgiving and ordered his slaves to eat the meat as well. When Zoe and her family refused, they were all arrested. They were forced to watch their sons be tortured, and then all 4 of them were put to death in a furnace. To watch your children die is a cruel torture, especially for a mother. But to tell your children to die rather than commit a serious sin is supernatural. Saint Felicity was a widow who with her husband had 7 sons. She raised her sons to be good and strong Christians faithful to God. Through her good example of her good works to others, she brought about the conversion of many pagans. The pagan priests were angry to see their gods abandoned and denounced her. She and her sons were brought before the prefect of Rome, who ordered her to sacrifice to idols, but they only proclaimed their faith instead. The prefect said to her, "How can you be so barbarous as to expose your children to torments and death? Have pity on these tender creatures, who are in the flower of their age and can aspire to the highest positions in the empire." Felicity replied, "My children will live eternally with Jesus Christ if they are faithful. They will have only eternal torments to await if they sacrifice to idols. Your apparent pity is but a cruel impiety." Then, turning to her children, she said, "Look towards heaven where Jesus Christ is waiting for you with his saints. Be faithful in his love and fight courageously for your souls." The judge then took each one of her sons, one by one, and tried to talk them into renouncing their faith. Each son refused. They were all scourged and then taken to prison. Soon they were all put to death in various ways. Januarius was beaten until he died by leather straps capped with lead. Felix and Philip were killed with bludgeons. Sylvanus was thrown headfirst from a cliff. Alexander, Vitalis, and Martial were beheaded. Felicity, the mother of these saintly sons, suffered martyrdom 8 times by watching each of her sons die and then being put to death herself. Perpetua was a noblewoman who was brought up by her Christian mother and her pagan father. Living during the times of Christian persecution, her father begged her to give up her faith, but she did not. From her diary, Perpetua writes of a conversation she had with her father. "When my father in his affection for me was trying to turn me from my purpose by arguments and thus weaken my faith, I said to him, 'Do you see this vessel, this water pot, or whatever it may be? Can it be called by any other name than what it is?' 'No,' he replied. 'So also I cannot call myself by any other name than what I am, a Christian.'" Perpetua was imprisoned at the age of 22. Along with Perpetua were 3 other Christian women and a slave woman by the name of Felicity. Felicity was expecting her own baby. Thanks to some letters that have been preserved, we have some idea of the sufferings these Christian women went through. Perpetua writes, "My father tried in vain to make me renounce my faith. I refused. Then my father threw himself on me as if he would pluck out my eyes. During those days we were baptized. A few days later we were lodged in the prison. I have never known such darkness, terrible heat, rough treatment. To crown all, I was tormented with anxiety for my baby. My baby was brought to me and I nursed him, for he already was faint for want of food." Then she describes a vision that she saw that gave her courage and hope. "I prayed and this was shown to me. I saw a golden ladder of wonderful length reaching up to heaven, but so narrow that only one at a time could ascend. At the foot of the ladder was a huge dragon, which lay in wait for those going up and sought to frighten them from ascent. And I went up and saw a vast garden, and sitting in the midst a tall man in the dress of a shepherd, and all around him were many thousands clad in white. He raised his head and said, "Thou art welcome, my child." Perpetua's father would not give up. If he couldn't get Perpetua to give in for her own sake, then he would get her to give in for the sake of her baby. He told her how her baby would suffer without her, and that he would die without her milk. Already full of anxiety for her baby, Perpetua still wouldn't give in, but she gave this matter to God. At her trial, she remained steadfast. Her father tried to drag her away, but he was beaten by soldiers. From that moment on, her baby miraculously no longer needed milk. The 5 Christian women were sentenced to die in the amphitheater in public sports. Felicity was worried about her unborn baby, and so miraculously she gave birth a few days before she was sentenced to die. The baby girl was adopted by another Christian woman. Watching the joy and faith of these women even converted their guard. As they were sent out to the arena, they sang hymns as they marched around. The other women died, but both Perpetua and Felicity survived the attacks of the beasts. They were then to be beheaded by gladiators. The executioner who was to behead Perpetua was so nervous and emotional that Perpetua had to guide his sword. The names of Perpetua and Felicity appear in the canon of the Mass. Saint Perpetua is the patroness of expectant mothers, and Saint Felicity is the patroness of those who cannot conceive. This saint lived in the 9th century in Spain. Her husband, Aurelius, was secretly a Christian, although outwardly he pretended to conform to the Islamic faith. He converted his wife Natalia to Christianity, and at first they lived their Christian faith in private. But seeing other Christians standing up for their faith despite being martyred, they decided as a couple to make a public confession of their newfound faith. The one thing Natalia worried about was her 2 daughters, that they would also become Muslims as established by Muslim laws. Arrangements were made for a Christian woman to take the girls in. With this done, Natalia and Aurelius lived their faith openly to encourage other Christians to live their faith. They even opened their house for secret masses. They were eventually arrested, and after much questioning and torturing, they were both beheaded. Before she was Margaret Clitheroe, she was first Margaret Middleton. She was born in York, England, during the time of persecution against Catholics by those who had made the monarch head of the English Church instead of the Pope. At 15 years old, Margaret married a widower, John Clitheroe. She mothered his own children and bore 2 of her own. In 1574, Margaret converted to Catholicism. Her husband John was a Protestant, but was very supportive of his wife's decision, since his brother was a priest. He even paid her fines for not attending the Protestant church. Margaret didn't want to risk her husband's safety by setting up secret masses in her home, but when her friend's hiding hole for Catholic priests was discovered, she helped build a space on the top floor between her house and the neighbors. She also rented another house a distance away where she housed priests and secret masses were made. Eventually, she was discovered and arrested in 1577. In those times, mothers were allowed to bring their children into jail with them, but Margaret was not. Being separated from her children was her greatest cross, and later, after her release, she had said that if it wasn't for the love for her family, she would have stayed in prison with God forever. While in jail to pass the time, she encouraged other Christians and also learned to read and write. She studied the Gospels and read Thomas Kempis's The Imitation of Christ. Once out of jail, Margaret continued to hide priests and arrange hidden masses. Again, she was arrested. She refused a formal trial for the sake of her children, who would have been forced to testify against her. This meant that she would be put to death. Wishing to set her free, the judges begged her to renounce her faith and to swear her allegiance to the Queen instead. When she refused, they accused her of cruelty to her husband and children. The night before her execution, she spent her time in fasting and prayer. The day of her execution, she walked barefoot to the place of torture. There she was stripped naked and blindfolded. She was told to lay on the ground on a sharp rock and was pressed under a weight of about 800 pounds with her own door. While lying there being crushed, she called out, "Jesu, Jesu, Jesu, have mercy on me." The sharp rock eventually broke her back, and she died within 15 minutes, but they left her body there on the ground, on the sharp rock and under the door, for over 6 hours. Of his wife, John had no bad feelings but only pride. He said, "Let them take all I have and save her, for she is the best wife in all England and the best Catholic."